If you have a request, make that known. So today, you all will hear from one of our hopefully it's a new friend, Sarah Davis, MJ Jorgensen, and Tracy Kennedy, as they talk about coalitions, the building blocks for success. And Sarah's going to shift to the next slide, and you all will see that this is our funding disclaimer. So the work that we are doing here today is supported by a grant for the Southwest Prevention Technology Transfer Center, located in the great state of Oklahoma, out of the great University of Oklahoma in Norman. And so you'll see our grant number. The Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, as we fondly know, as SAMHSA, funds us. My name is LaShonda Williamson Jennings, and I have the great honor of being the co-director for the Southwest PTTC. We serve the states of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana. Anytime I think about Louisiana lately, I certainly want to take a pause and let our friends from Louisiana know that you all are still in our hearts and our minds as you all begin to recover from Hurricane Ida. And so let's just take a moment of silence to really send out great vibes and good intentions and hopes for our friends in Louisiana. Mm-hmm. Thank you all for observing that moment of silence for our friends in Louisiana. I also want you all to know that the views, opinions, and content expressed in today's workshop don't necessarily reflect those views and opinions or policies of our funder at SAMHSA. So I get the great opportunity of introducing one of our new friends of the Southwest Prevention Technology Transfer Center, Sarah Davis. Sarah Davis is she works out of the Rocky Mountain Public Health Training Center, and trainings about coalitions and working with coalitions. You'll hear more about her experience in tobacco. You'll hear more about her training experience, and you certainly, will learn a lot about how do you connect, how do you either refresh or begin to start your prevention journey. So Sarah Davis, I'd like to turn the time over to you.
Great, thanks, LaShonda. So pleased to be here, and it is great to see familiar faces and names from those of you who were able to be with us yesterday, and welcome to those of you new joining here today. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm Sarah Davis. I'm the Associate Director of the Rocky Mountain Public Health Training Center. We're based at the Colorado School of Public Health. So some quick background about me. I've been with the Rocky Mountain Public Health Training Center for 6 years. Prior to that, I was with the American Lung Association of the Southwest, where I worked with numerous smoke-free coalitions and was part of the state's smoke-free and tobacco tax efforts. So those are really nice achievements for me to have been a part of. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, but I now live in Denver, Colorado, where I'm a mom to a high schooler and 2 dogs, one of whom you'll see with me in the room today. I like checking out local breweries. I'm an avid reader, an audiobook listener. I'm a fair weather skier. I really only like to ski when the sun is shining. And I'm a TRX instructor. So those are just a few little pieces about me. Other things about who I am: I'm white, college educated, able-bodied, cisgender female, and a native English speaker. So I share that because all of those experiences are part of my identity, and they've really shaped how I've been able to move throughout the world, and they shape how I show up here with you today. So I want to recognize that all of you are full people bringing your whole selves to this particular workshop, and want to welcome you here today. I'm also really pleased to have with me 2 guest presenters. The first is Tracy Kennedy. So Tracy and I worked together many years ago doing tobacco control work. She's been fighting for smoke-free air since she testified at her first city council meeting as a high school student, which was, I think, just last week, Tracy, right? When you were a high school student? Yeah. So in her current role as the Midwest State Strategist for the Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation, she works in a challenging 13-state territory at the local and statewide level to ensure that all employees are protected from secondhand smoke while they're at work. Tracy's passionate about the power of coalition building and grassroots policy change to impact population health. And when she's not crusading for public health, Tracy pursues her love for travel to meet new places and people, as well as enjoying adventures with friends and family. So you're going to get to hear from Tracy soon. While we're waiting for that, Tracy, while I'm introducing MJ, why don't you share something that we might not know about you that I didn't include in your bio in the chat? Maybe a funny fact about you. So later in the workshop, we'll also hear from MJ Jorgensen, who works on the community impact team for the Health District of Northern Larimer County in Colorado. MJ is a dedicated strategist, relationship builder, and educator. And their past and current work has been focused around using community collaboration, effective relationships, and harm reduction strategies to improve mental health and substance use treatment access, quality, and equity for marginalized individuals and communities, including people living with substance use disorders, LGBTQIA+ individuals, people who are criminal justice involved, people of color, and people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. MJ was selected to participate in a 3-year Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Culture of Health Leaders program, which focuses on advancing the culture of health through diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm really excited to have both MJ and Tracy here. And I think you could tell from the little bit of bio that I shared about them, they're bringing lots of years of experience working within communities and in partnership with communities, and have great stuff to share around community engagement. So MJ, it's your turn to share your fun fact about yourself with us in the chat, and then we'll look forward to hearing from you more in just a little bit. So here are our learning objectives for the workshops yesterday and today. Today, we're going to focus on those second and third bullet points, really talking about coalition structures and how those can help us meet different needs, and looking at strategies that encourage engagement, inclusion, and the sharing of power. So as LaShonda mentioned, the format for today is not a webinar, it's an interactive workshop. So I'm going to encourage you to use the chat as well as speaking out. So unmuting yourself when we're having our full group discussions. So we've already been practicing using the chat. You're already an engaged group, which is fantastic. So thanks so much. The presenters and I are going to share some content via slides, and then we'll also be asking you all to engage in some large and small group discussions. And in order to help us do that, we're going to ask that you turn on your camera while we're having these full group discussions or our small group discussions. And that's really helpful so that we can see each other's eyeballs and see some nodding heads and questioning looks and smiling faces, and it helps us engage with each other. And if you don't have a camera or aren't able to turn your camera on for some reason when we're having these discussions, make sure you're extra engaged in the chat and by using those emoji reactions in your toolbar as well, so that we know that you're still with us. While we are sharing our screen and going over slides, totally fine to take a video break and turn your camera off if you'd like to during those times. So when I stop sharing my screen, that's the cue to turn your cameras on. It's great to see so many of you with your cameras on already. Fully recognize that many of us are working from home still, where we have dogs and cats and, who will walk across our desk, and kids and doorbells and partners and all of that may be distractions around us. That's okay. Again, invite you to be here with your whole self. We're a welcoming group here. And on that note, I'd like to invite you to rename yourself. And I see that many of you have already added your pronouns in parentheses behind your name. Invite those of you who haven't to do so. And there are a couple different options. So to rename yourself, you're going to right-click on the box with your picture in it. and click rename. So first of all, make sure that it's your name that's up there. Some of us are sharing Zoom accounts. And then secondly, put in parentheses either your pronouns or type my name if you'd like us to use your name instead of pronouns during the session. So Elizabeth is dropping a resource link in the chat. For those of you who want to learn more about pronouns and why it's important to use them, it's one of the things that we can do as facilitators or group leaders to welcome people and make it known at the beginning that we're inviting folks to bring their full selves into the space. So thanks so much for folks who have already done that. All right, so here's where we're going next. Here's the agenda for today. So during this morning's session, we're going to be looking at things like coalition structure and meeting design and the roles that those can play in helping keep members engaged by using their time well. And we're going to look at various strategies to ensure that we're honoring and valuing community voice throughout the work that we do. So let's look briefly at what we covered yesterday for those of you who weren't able to join us in the workshop yesterday. We talked about tuning our radio dials to station WIIFM, which stands for What's in It for Me. So taking some time to consider how each of the individuals or the groups who we want involved in our coalition efforts, how might they answer that question of what's in it for me to be involved in this effort, and making sure that we're really clear about where the mutual benefit lies. We also looked at changing our mindset from why do we want somebody involved to why might it be important to them to be involved. And we talked about things that serve as either facilitators or barriers or challenges that discourage engagement. And through that brainstorming, we identified some common themes for reasons that people choose to get involved with something and then why they stay involved. Because I'm getting some benefit from participating, whether that's social benefit or altruistic or personal or professional, I'm getting something out of my participation with your coalition. Being involved with this group is a good use of my time and talents. We all have lots of demands on our time, so we want to be involved with things where we feel like we have something to contribute and our time's being used well. And the last one is really important, that we feel like our voice is honored and it matters that we are part of this effort and that we are part of the creation of this effort. So yesterday we talked about tapping into the benefits for others for participating, and today we're really going to explore the good use of time and talents and my voice matters. And we ended yesterday talking about some strategies that help keep people engaged. So we talked about dealing with silence when we hear crickets in those coalition meetings and what that might mean, and strategies for how we might encourage some engagement. Related to that, how do we create a space of belonging where folks feel like they do belong, that their voice is welcome in the space? And we also talked about reflecting on our own identities so that we can be more self-aware when we conduct our engagement efforts. Finally, we also developed a set of agreements for our time together yesterday, and I'd like to carry those forward into the space that we have together this morning. So if you will please look these over, and in just a minute, I'm going to ask for a thumbs up if you are in agreement with these, that during the 2 hours that we're together today, that we can stay focused, have an open mind and open heart, that we can share ideas openly with each other. We talked about having one person speak at a time, having patience with technology. I always really appreciate that as a facilitator. We're going to mute ourselves when we're not speaking. Don't yuck my yum, which was a contribution from LaShonda of recognizing that we all have our own communities, we all have our own ways of doing things. So if something's working someplace, no need to rain on a parade. So don't yuck my yum. Being empathetic and assuming good intentions. So we talked about that we want to assume that folks, when they're making a statement or a comment, have good intentions in this group, and that we also welcome folks to say, oops, that didn't come out the way I wanted it to, or to have someone say, ouch, that didn't feel good, what you just said, and have some dialogue around that. So really want to create a learning space together this morning. We don't always have to have the right answer the first time. So happy to have us all together so that we can learn together, and then being able to honor the silence. So that's a cue for us as facilitators to sit back when we ask a question and make sure that there's enough time for folks to process and come up with the answer. So go ahead and give me your real thumb or your emoji thumb and keep it up for a minute because I have to scan across a couple screens. So I see many people, not everybody yet. Feel free to drop it in the chat if you're on a phone or something and can't do it that way. Thank you. I see some thumbs in the chat, scanning the other screen. Okay, I see most people with thumbs up. Let me give just a second here of space if there is anybody who feels like we're missing something from our agreement or you can't be in full agreement. Now's your time to comment. Okay, I think we're in a good space to move forward. Thanks, everybody. So let's do some quick introductions. We're going to put you into groups of about 3, and you'll have just about 6 minutes in your group, so make sure that everybody has a chance to introduce themselves. And introduce yourself. Who are you? What type of coalition or coalitions are you working with? And answer the question of what do you need in order to take your coalition work to the next level? So what do you need? I'm going to stop sharing, and I think Elizabeth or Wanda are putting us into breakout rooms. All of us coming back in. Oh, just want to say again, what a great group we have with us today. So we've got 60 folks here today. Good to see you all. So welcome back. As we move into our next segment, I'd love to hear some of what you came up with as to what you need to advance your coalition work. So let's have a couple folks drop theirs in the chat. I know there were some common themes in the group that I was in. I'm curious to hear what other folks came up with. More staff, or we'll take volunteers. Good. What else? What do you need to move your coalition work forward? More sectors represented. Okay, so maybe you have representation from a few different groups, but would like to have more sectors. Shifting from report out to action. Yeah. Keep building our members and volunteers. In-person meetings. Yeah, how many of you are yearning for return to in-person meetings? See some nodding heads, a few hands. Yeah, this has been hard with COVID to both move to the virtual space and move to the virtual space and try and keep folks connected. So better communication to the community, more participation from our members, sharing of data between agencies. Yeah, so outreach, expanding the outreach to get out from the core community. Snacks. Yes, where has the onion dip been? More coalition members. So I certainly heard that in my small group as well, of kind of re-engaging the existing members and the members who had been there before and recruiting some new members. So more members who are boots on the ground. So not just folks who are there because it's part of their job, more buy-in. Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing that. So yesterday, the group brainstormed reasons why we chose to get involved or not to get involved in different efforts or groups. And one of those themes that came up was that people are busy. We've got a lot of stuff going on. There are lots of things competing for our time. And so we tend to get involved and stay involved in those efforts that are using our time well and that are a good match for what we have to offer, the skills or the talents or the gifts that we bring to the table. So with that, I want to welcome Tracy Kennedy. Tracy's had the benefit of working in this 13-state region. So she's had the benefit of seeing a lot of different coalitions in action. So I'm excited to hear her perspective on how a coalition structure, how you set up your coalition's work, can aid in you using your time well. And I think especially think about some of these challenges that some of you mentioned about re-engaging folks who were engaged in the past, or how do you engage folks in that virtual space? So Tracy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us and for having me today. You know, I have been doing this work and working directly with coalitions for the last decade. And right now I serve as the Midwest State Strategist for Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights. And right before that, I led the statewide Tobacco Prevention Coalition for Missouri, Tobacco-Free Missouri. So coalition work has just been the lifeblood of what I do. But it's what keeps me in this work, because I find working with groups of people so inspiring. And in a climate where there's a lot of tension and a lot of difficult problems, there's just such magic in the process of people coming together from their community, and building skills and learning and doing outreach and communication. And then they come together to create change in their community. And what you see in that process is just nothing short of magical, because not only do you see the broad-based community impact and real change for those people, but you see the individuals change and grow. And then whatever project you might be working on, whether it's a policy or whatever goal you might be trying to reach, it's amazing for me to then look back, and catch up in 5 years and see the other ways these same individuals have worked to address problems in their community. So the reason I am so committed to this, and the reason I am so excited to talk to you all about this today, is because it works, right? So coalitions have such impact, and the dynamics really matter. So even though it's a Friday morning, and you've probably participated on virtual trainings already this week, we are going to try to stretch our brains a little bit today. We're trying to be more nimble, and we're trying to be more flexible to think about how can we reimagine coalition work. And, I think the reason is this whole formula I just kind of described is how do we build power? Everything I kind of talk about today is all going to be under the guise of how do we create dynamic and action-oriented coalitions that build power, because that's how we realize community change. That's how we get decision maker attention. That's how we build political will. It really is all about building power. And when you base your coalition in this type of movement, this work can be fun, exciting, and even, dare I say, glamorous. And I know that many of us are public health professionals and likely did not go into this field for the glamour. But the last year and a half, we have some really exciting projects I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, and it made my job feel glamorous. So, I think that's why we're flexing here a little bit, because while many of you probably have really well-established, successful routines bringing groups together, if you're not reaching your goals, it may be time to rethink who's around the table and what the table looks like and what room the table is in, if you're following me through the metaphor here. And that's the other thing I really want to hit home today, is that some of the work that we do is really grounded in what supports that work, or what the framework is. So perhaps your coalition has been based on the grant that funds your role. And so the funding agency may require certain boxes. We even have them. We have a coalition assessment that says, check these 25 boxes. Here are people that might be good to engage in your community. But what does that even mean? What does it mean when you say, yes, this person is involved in my coalition? We really want to move beyond that to a really authentic engagement level from the beginning. So we're not speaking to the populations in our communities. We're thinking, okay, what makes us who we are? What are the unique aspects of our community? And how do we tap into the voices that make us who we are? And instead of speaking at these people, how do we bring them into our work? And what does that look like? But to be able to do that, it might mean not meeting every Tuesday at noon, because perhaps this is a group of retired veterans, like this example in this picture from Pennsylvania. So many of them are retirement age. They don't like to travel, but they also don't like to use technology. So how do we acknowledge the barriers to participation that we might not even realize we've created? And even if you think the systems you have in place help make your work predictable, there can be benefits to that kind of stability. but it may require moving beyond that to reach another sphere of engagement. So let's go to the next slide and kind of talk about, if you're a visual learner like me, what does it look like if it's not me and the 6 to 10 people that meet weekly as a coalition, then what is it and what is the function? So that group of committed people is likely your steering committee, where you can see this your innermost circle. And some of you may be funded to do the work. This is likely part of your job. You might be responsible for the grant commitments or the grant agreements, for writing the strategic plan. So no doubt a small group of committed steering committee members can really accomplish a lot. But to be able to really cross that threshold and achieve your goals, you're going to have to expand to these outer circles. But the beauty of that means that not everyone can do something, but not everyone has to do everything, is the beauty of this kind of model. So then you go out to your active members, and these are people who might be involved in like a committee or a work group or a specific event. And this is how your circle gets bigger. And beyond that, you have your coffee members who you can call, and they might come to your event or help support or sponsor or lend their voice and share on their social media. And then beyond that, you have maybe sometimes your more passive supporters who have signed up for your database. And we kind of have this rule of thumb at Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights that we really like to see a database of supporters that has a threshold of at least 10% of your community's population. So that's kind of a rule of thumb we've used for a long time. And I am pushing us to think beyond that, right? It's not about just having a database with a bunch of people in it. It's about knowing who you can call on and when, and what's the best way to reach them, and helping to meet them by understanding what's in it for them. And when you look at this orange interested population and you think, how do I bring the interested population closer to my inner circle? It's by tapping into that with them, that's what's in it for me. Okay, let's go to the next slide just for another kind of structural example. And this one, so this is from Colorado. Thank you, Sarah, for this. And looking specifically at the issue of prescription drug abuse prevention. And so if you're working in the prevention field and you think about how a problem can be really complex, and you want to bring together a lot of subject matter experts that perhaps are coming from a really different worldview, allowing a structure that facilitates individualized and customized meetings based on that expertise really helps to maximize time and efforts. And then maybe you just come together and make sure you find a way to kind of liaison between these groups. And that's another example on the next slide. So each of these kind of work groups or committees has leadership, like a chair or a co-chair, and that's who perhaps is reporting back to your main group. But allowing experts to kind of serve where they are, especially too when you talk about scheduling is like such a barrier and a nightmare. So sometimes by customizing and tailoring these groups, you can kind of get in a better flow of not having to do a doodle poll every month or however people are scheduling these days. So Sarah, will you show us the next slide of a closer glimpse at what one of those work groups might look like? So for example, for prescription drug monitoring, if you have law enforcement, the law enforcement approach, bringing them together to have their input on a group might be very different than another group. And so when we all come together, it helps us to appreciate those dynamics, but we want to maximize the time available by really focusing on individualized expert. So I'm gonna move on to talking about a few examples of how dynamic coalition work is moving the needle for our issue of smoke-free air. But while I'm doing that, I would love for y'all to drop in the chat if there's a structure for your coalition, if you work in committees or work groups, or a structure that might be working for you. Feel free to kind of drop a note about that in the chat. And it's funny, as I'm speaking to you all, I try to be really cognizant of my language too. So depending on so my worldview, I'm a mom, I have 2 little kids, my life feels really full and like many of us, I try not even to say busy. Everyone's busy. Even Beyonce only has 24 hours in her day as well. But when someone's asking me to commit to something, there are certain words that sometimes I think, I don't know if I have time for that, right? So if someone comes to me and says, would you be interested in serving on a coalition work group? I'm like, ooh, I don't know. I don't know if I can be on another committee. So as I'm speaking to you, I'm trying to kind of go through the range of language, because sometimes it's even just a shift in how we talk about our coalition. So in the state of West Virginia, we were struggling. We wanted to bring together a cross section of partners. So we had different goals, we had different missions, but we all together wanted to prevent certain legislation from passing in the state of West Virginia for different reasons. So instead of calling it we didn't want to have a name, we didn't want to have a brand, but we did have some power in sharing intel and influence. So we called it a round table because for some reason, the word coalition was just really people weren't willing to commit to it. So we called it a round table. So I encourage you too in the chat, if you have used a different term to talk about how you work as a group, like round table, drop that in the chat because I always find that fascinating too. So in my remaining 5 minutes, I just want to give you 2 examples of how at Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights, our primary issue is smoke-free air, and guaranteeing that everyone has the right to breathe smoke-free air at work, no matter where they work. And we mainly achieve that through policy change, and we work towards policy change through building strong coalitions. So over the last year and a half plus, we've seen tremendous growth in the number of tribal casinos who have adopted temporary smoke-free policies. So we were trying to quickly build kind of coalitions and power to understand how do we move from a temporary policy to a permanent policy. So kind of ad hoc organizing. Where do we see an opportunity and how do we build around that opportunity? So with the tribal population, we saw something really unique and dynamic, going back to a radio show. So this is specific to Navajo Nation, and this was a radio show. You can see a picture. That's Missy Tracy and my colleague Charday. And this Navajo Nation radio show reached thousands of people in Navajo Nation listening to this radio show. And the speakers included one of our consultants, Clinton Isham, who is a member of a tribe, and then Brian Christopher, who is actually a social media influencer and has paid subscribers who pay money to watch him play slot machines on YouTube. So, even at Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights, our kind of broader national-based coalition, we were thinking, who can we bring to the table that can speak authentically to members of Navajo Nation to help move them towards our policy goal? And we're not the ones talking about it. Even though we might feel we have a true expertise and commitment to this issue, in order to gain traction, we needed to bring new voices. So we focused on Missy Tracy, who herself is a tribal gaming manager, works in management at Ho Chunk Gaming, someone from the gaming industry who's not in public health, and then someone from a tribal population to speak directly to their peers. So really taking that layered approach, instead of us telling the story for these people, engaging these voices on a platform that reached them best. And I'm happy to report that now Navajo Nation is considering a permanent smoke-free policy for all of their gaming operations, which is just fantastic. And we just like to think that by being flexible and being nimble and doing this ad hoc organizing, we were able to respond to a new way and get some new attention. So one other quick example I want to tell you about, especially because I did not even know Sarah Davis was originally from Nashville, Tennessee. So I'm going to have to recruit her. So we have seen really persistent gaps in smoke-free protections. And we've talked a lot about how we study priority populations. Who falls into this gap? Who's most exposed to secondhand smoke? And we were always kind of checking the box to say, yes, these people are more exposed to secondhand smoke. And we were going to decision makers and saying, you should care that these people are exposed to secondhand smoke. What are you going to do about it? And decision makers honestly just weren't listening, because there were other more pressing issues, always something else. There was an election, there was an opioid crisis, whatever it might be, which were all legitimate concerns, but we're really having trouble breaking through. And in the meantime, these people are being exposed to toxic cancer-causing chemicals. So we started working directly with musicians. And particularly during the pandemic, when musicians were not out on tour and their livelihoods were really in jeopardy, we worked directly with musicians to go on record in support of smoke-free music venues and performing in smoke-free spaces, and building towards making smoke-free music cities. And we would pay musicians for their time because this is their craft and we're not going to ask them to do it for free. So beyond that, then we saw the rise, and we connected with this individual, Jamie Kent, who is now leading his own musician-based coalition in Tennessee to get smoke-free music venues. And lawmakers are opening their doors and are so excited to meet with Jamie because they feel he has a really authentic message to share. And so he's been able to break through barriers we were not able to break through as our traditional coalition, where we had sat around the table for a decade plus with the American Lung Association and the Heart Association and our public health partners and our community health partners, and no one was listening. But then through a new voice, we even have a campaign song. So you can see how this has its own brand, it has its own unique feel. And what it has done is created new energy where people want to come to the coalition. People want to come to the meeting because they want to be a part of this. They want to see this change for their community instead of, feeling like you're really asking someone to give something. They're really getting so much in return because they want to be a part of this movement and this momentum. So I just share these couple examples of how we can be nimble and how we can respond and how we can think beyond just, yes, this person has come to a meeting, and say, who are the powerful and authentic and unique voices in our community, and how can we best bring that voice to our issue and into our work? And it might not be into that inner circle steering committee, but how do we move them from that most outer circle? Like maybe they're interested, maybe they enjoy smoke-free air, for example. How can we bring them closer to our core policy work? So I'm going to stick around for the rest of the presentation, but I'm going to now look through your comments in the chat. And Sarah, I think, are we doing questions after? Doing questions now? Later?
Yeah, I think if you have questions for Tracy, let's keep those going in the chat, and she'll be replying to those, and then we'll have some more discussion opportunities coming up. So thanks, Tracy, for sharing some of the glamour and energy that we might forget about with coalitions or roundtables or community networks. I loved seeing the different terminology that folks are using. So thanks for that. So another part of using people's time well and making good use of their time, making good use of the unique talents that they have to bring, is making sure that we're using their time well when we are bringing them together. So whether this is a coalition meeting or your action team meeting, or a meeting that you're having with a particular group of partners or supporters, you always want to be clear about what the purpose of that particular meeting is. And I think sometimes I want to make the distinction between knowing what the purpose of your group is and the purpose of each specific meeting that you're having. So you should always be able to answer the question, and you might even think about putting it in the calendar invite about why are we meeting? What's the purpose of this meeting? What are we hoping to walk away from this meeting with? How will we know if this meeting has been worth it? So you want to be able to answer that question. Why are we meeting? Do you even need a meeting? And holding that purpose of your meeting as the North Star really helps you guide how you're then going to structure each individual meeting. And I think, as Tracy mentioned, some of us have been on coalitions and with groups that have been meeting for a decade. And we've been having, we sort of do the same things at each meeting. And there's an opportunity for us to step back, reimagine, and make sure that we're able to answer the question for each time that we meet. What's the purpose? What am I trying to walk away with? So maybe the purpose is we need to agree on a budget, or we need to bring more supporters of the coalition together. We need to bring more people into the fold. The purpose of that meeting is going to drive the strategy of the activities and how you run that meeting. So just like the famous mullet haircut a meeting can also have more than one purpose. So you might be bringing folks together to celebrate some accomplishments and make plans for engaging other individuals for your committee. So thinking about what the purpose or purposes of each meeting is. And thanks to Elizabeth for dropping in the agenda, the meeting planning worksheet. This is a resource. We're not going to go through it in depth today, but it's a resource for you to take with you if it's helpful in terms of how to plan a meeting. So this worksheet helps you think through identifying the purpose of each meeting and then using that purpose to structure each agenda item so that you're meeting that purpose. I've always liked this sandwich metaphor, and it's not just because I like sandwiches, but I like the sandwich metaphor for creating an agenda. As you think about, you've got your buns on your top and your bottom bun, or your openers and closers. So openers, things like introductions and warm-ups and checking in on the previous action items. Maybe you're doing group agreements. And then you have the closers for your meetings, where you're making sure to leave folks with what the action steps are for the next between now and the next time you're going to get together. And then you've got all that good stuff in the middle. You've got your meat or your tofu and your veggies, your special sauce. That's really the bulk of your meeting. So thinking about how do you structure each part of that meeting so that it's helping you serve your purpose. So I'm going to ask Elizabeth or Wanda, I'm not sure which one of you has the poll, but if you could launch that. We'd love to hear from folks about what the most challenging part of the meeting to do well is. And this is assuming that all of you have been at a meeting. I think it's a safe assumption. You've probably been at about 20 already this week. What's the most challenging part of the meeting to do well? And once you've answered the poll, this is your cue to go ahead and turn your camera back on if you've got one, so that we can have a little bit of discussion here together. And Wanda, Elizabeth, I'll let you let us know when we can share those poll results. Great to see those faces. All right, so here's our poll. The part of the meeting that is most challenging to do well, almost half of you agree that it is engaging participants in discussion. A close second, facilitating decision-making, the follow-up part, also a challenging part. So I want to hear more about what is it that's challenging about engaging people in discussion. So go ahead and take yourself off mute or drop your thoughts in the chat for us.
Sarah, for me, I think it's because we've moved to Zoom platform or a virtual platform, as opposed to being in person, when you can maybe actually even see the expression more on people's face or the interaction. So behind the Zoom platform, it's like people normally just kind of stare at you and like, I don't know who wants to speak first. So, you know, being able to have that, you know, friendship amongst each other around the table that makes you feel most comfortable. I think you're just a little uneasy with the Zoom platform. So you're like, I don't know if I should be the first person. So I'm always saying, well, let me just go on and talk first, and then everybody else can kind of talk after me, you know, just kind of break the ice a little bit. But I think it's just the platform that we're on that's making it more difficult to get those engaging things that we normally would have around a table. So that's for me.
Thank you so much, Amy, both for sharing that great insight and for being the first one to speak up. So now the rest of you know that Amy found her mute button, and you can too. So yes, virtual meeting space certainly creates a new level of challenge and separation for us. Makes it harder to engage. What else is challenging about engaging people in discussion, in person or virtually?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Ashley.
Awesome. So hi, thank y'all so much. So I'm gonna play devil's advocate a little bit and say that it was challenging even before virtual meetings. I got lucky and I got to watch our coalition coordinator and be a part of the coalition. Then I got to be the coordinator, and now I get to be the program director. And so one thing that we heard from our members is it was a lot of sit and get. And so the coalition coordinator was doing all the work and doing all these implementations, and the coalition kind of just sat there every month and got an update and then they moved on. And so one thing I've noticed as I've transitioned is to run a meeting is kind of like running a classroom. And as teachers, we have class. So I have a background in education, and we have whole semester long classes on classroom management and fostering engagement and fostering higher levels of learning and commitment. But we don't have that kind of training in the coalition world, where essentially we are leading a class, leading a charge, but on a much grander scale with a lot more complexities, because you're not required to be there. So I think sometimes just having a classroom management background or a meeting facilitating background helps a lot.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Ashley. So thinking about what are those other skills that we need as maybe the facilitator of the coalition, or trying to move away from being the facilitator and being the supporter of someone else being the facilitator. So we might need to develop some other skills.
Sarah, so I spent the most of my career being a community and political organizer. And so some things that kind of helped with us was the power of the pre-meeting. So bringing together like the core kind of, I guess it would be the steering committee, or to try and talk about, okay, here's the agenda, but also if we had different pieces, I would try to seek out other people to present that part of the agenda. If there was a key discussion, I would reach out to a few people ahead of time and be like, hey, we're going to be talking about this. You had a great suggestion in our conversation. When we bring this up, you know, is it all right if I kind of call on you to kick off the discussion, which tends to help. And then the other thing that I've done in the past is I notice a lot of people get really shy about speaking up in front of the whole group. But if I separate the room into smaller groups, then there's a super rich discussion, because people are way more comfortable around 2 or 3 people. And so what I usually do is I'll have a small group discussion with one of the questions, and then we'll come back to the larger group and I will float between. And then anything I heard that sounded good, I'd be like, okay, well, let's kind of report back like, oh, you know, Susie, you said that, you know, this really cool thing, would you mind sharing with the group? And so like they were able to kind of test their idea in the small group, and then they've had it be validated by that group and then myself for the other leaders, and then they feel a little more comfortable sharing. But I try to have plans. So I'm not completely leaving it up to chance and just getting crickets. And I think you could do that for a Zoom meeting as well with the breakout session.
I love it. LaShonda, here's your next training on the power of the pre-meeting. I love it. So MJ, why do you call your plants pineapples?
Because they kind of stick out and put their hand up like a palm.
Perfect. So no shame in having those pre-meetings and encouraging folks who you know might have something to share and get the conversation started. Excellent. All right, so let's move on to that next question about facilitating decision-making. Almost a third of you said that you found that to be the most challenging. What are some of the challenges you've run into around decision-making? Yeah, Karen.
I think it's a combination of things in our coalition. We often have lively, engaged discussions, and sometimes you get folks who over contribute a little bit and maybe exert their opinions a little stronger than you can read. When you read the room, you can see other people's, body language in response to that. So I find the challenge to be, I don't necessarily like to force decisions on the group. I try to go by consensus as the facilitator, but when you have heavier handed contributions by some of your members, I find that a little challenging, and I'd be really interested in any feedback people might have about that. Because again, I really try to lead by consensus as best as I can, but sometimes I'm finding that isn't always successful when that happens.
Anybody else have some, I forgot the term that you used. You had a very, very diplomatic term for people who talk a lot.
Overly strong contributors.
Yes, overly strong, enthusiastic contributors who are maybe not allowing other voices to be heard quite as much. What's helping? I love the comment, Jennifer, that you made about the breakout rooms or sort of separating folks into some smaller groups. That could be one strategy. Other ideas that folks have?
One thing that we do is, I copy this from another group that typically works with youth. And what we do is we assume everyone has something to say. And so if it's my turn, then I'm going to say, I'm going to throw it to Sarah. And Sarah's going to toss it to Tracy. And Tracy's going to toss it to Robbie. And when Robbie's done, she's going to toss it to Wanda. And when Wanda's done, etc. So that everyone tosses the ball to someone else. So it's random. And that kind of ups the ante a little bit, as you can imagine. But it also engages everyone. It's not me saying, okay, we're going to get picked on, because everyone is expecting the ball to be tossed to them. So it equalizes that whole exchange.
Thanks so much for sharing that idea, Astrid. And, that can be done if you have a ball, that's great. It can be done as a whip around or a round robin. It can be done on Zoom, where you're really intentionally setting up the space to ask every person to contribute. Tell me what you're thinking. What's your idea on this? And that it can also be set up so there's no discussion or response in between what each person says. But it's a way to invite all of the voices into the space. So thanks so much for those ideas. Keep putting them in the chat. I also want to highlight some things that Edward said in the chat about sometimes what makes decision-making hard is people get defensive when the decision doesn't align with personal view of what the decision should be. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And sometimes it can feel hard to make a decision because people aren't wanting to commit to something, as Alicia mentioned, or Lionel mentioned that people are overwhelmed with responsibilities and they have opposing views, and it's going to take time to find that middle ground. And that sometimes there's not the trust within a group to be able to have those disagreements and be able to talk through to find what the middle ground or what a consensus might be. Brent also reminds us about culture. So in Japan, people do not raise their hand when they have a question. They make eye contact. Otherwise, they look down out of respect. So thinking about and again, this is where it can be really helpful to have that time for self-reflection and recognizing what your own identities are, and that those are not universal. So what is comfortable for you in a space may or may not be how everyone else in the space is going to speak up. They may wait to be called on. They may be looking for a smaller group space in order to voice their ideas. So really thinking about engagement in that particular way. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these next 3 slides because we've talked about a lot of these different ideas. I'll just briefly mention with introductions, that's such a common part of the opening of our meetings, and it's really worth some intentionality of thinking, how do we set up introductions, and thinking about how do I set up introductions so that it helps serve the purpose of the meeting. This can be a great time to think about what decisions am I going to be asking people to engage in? Are there going to be some contentious issues that are going to come up? How can I set up introductions in such a way that it's going to help serve the rest of the purpose of the meeting? We talked about, and thanks Astrid for bringing up this piece around, and also for Jennifer, that we can also often default to the full group discussion. And so that has a place, as does small group discussions, paired up opportunities, time for individual reflection. So all of those have a place in your meeting agenda as you think about what's going to best serve the purpose of the meeting. And then someone mentioned, the closing part is so hard about how do you make sure that folks actually follow through with those action steps. So I think if you have some great ideas, I know that some folks are really great at doing this, of how do you make sure that you're ending each meeting with some dedicated time to focus on action and then following through with folks after that. So we'd love to have people drop some ideas in the chat about how have you seen follow-up and closing done well for a meeting. Also want to introduce the idea of evaluation for your meetings. And this doesn't have to be a formal paper survey. This could be a quick poll at the end of the meeting that's anonymous. It could be an electronic survey that you send out afterwards. It could be calling somebody on the phone to say, I'd love to get some feedback about that meeting. I noticed that you were really quiet in the meeting, and as I think about planning for the next meeting, I want to get some feedback or input on what you thought of this one and how I might make it better for this next one. So really offering yourself that opportunity to get some input and feedback could be really valuable. So thanks to Jennifer and others for dropping some ideas in the chat. And I want to move us on because we're going to be talking about decision-making a little bit, and that came up as one of our challenging pieces. So we've talked about how to use people's time well. We're going to shift and spend the second half of our time together talking about that other pillar of engagement, that my voice matters. I'm going to be involved with something where I know that my contribution matters and that I have some power and leadership in this group. So let's look at how we can let folks know that their voice matters. What you're seeing here is the public participation spectrum, and there's certainly some flaws and critiques with this particular model, which we could talk about some other day, but we'll talk about it here for just a minute for what it's useful for. And MJ, did you want to jump in with a comment there?
Yeah, your screen isn't shared right now, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Yep. I figured you'd see me do this.
I appreciate it. All right, now you're seeing the public participation spectrum. Thanks for the thumbs up, Alicia, that's helpful. So what you're seeing here is a spectrum of how we can involve people. And on one side, there's informing. As we're moving further down the spectrum, we're consulting with folks, we're involving people, we're collaborating, and we're empowering. Again, we could take issue with the word empower because we all start with our own power to begin with. There's not one right or wrong place to be on this spectrum. It is important to recognize what's most appropriate for what you're seeking. So for example, if there's a lice outbreak at my daughter's school, I don't really want to be consulted about it. I just want to be informed about it. So that's a perfectly appropriate time where you're just informing people of something that's happening. The key element here is transparency and communication. And sometimes we use terms like we're collaborating with the community when really we're consulting or involving them in some way. So I want to have folks interact with this visual for just a second, and I'd like you to use your annotate feature. So if you go to the top of your Zoom screen, and you should see a little pencil icon that says annotate underneath it. So click on that annotate pencil. You'll see another menu drop down, and you can pick stamp. There's a little check mark that says stamp, and then pick one of those types of stamps. That's going to allow you to put a stamp on the screen that we all can see. So I'd like you to think about where you feel like your coalition is currently on this spectrum, and put a stamp in that spot. So what is your coalition doing mostly? Are you consulting with the community, collaborating, informing? Again, no judgment here. This is an opportunity for reflecting on what kind of engagement you're currently having with your community. Great, so seeing some stars pop up, and some of you are recognizing that you're in that space of informing the community of here's what we're doing, or here's what the information is. Others of you are involving, so you're working through the process to make sure that you're hearing what the community concerns are. And then others of you are further down the spectrum around collaborating, so really starting to co-design with the communities that you're working with. Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. So I'm going to clear all of our stamps here. All right, and move us along to one other diagram that I'll show you that's similar. So this is a spectrum that shows maximum appropriate involvement. And if we were to think about decision-making as being such a big part of what we do with coalition work, so this is a framework that comes from the Interaction Institute, and this one deals specifically with decision-making. And so what this shows is that as my involvement in a decision increases, so that x-axis, as I'm more involved in the decision, so does my level of ownership of that decision. So the more I'm involved in the decisions of the coalition, the higher my ownership and engagement and investment is. So as coalition leaders and facilitators and community engagers, we're challenging ourselves to think about how do we involve people in the maximum way possible. There's no one right way to make a decision. Different decisions make sense to make them different ways. The point is to make a very conscious decision about how you're going to go about making decisions within the community and within the coalition, and then communicate it. One thing that can happen is that when people vote and they think that they're deciding on something, but then it turns out that actually that group, they weren't the deciders. There was somebody else who actually has the power to make the decision. And that's a way to lose trust when we're working with community, is when we lead folks to believe that they are making a decision, but then a different decision happens. Maybe we were actually asking them for their opinion, or we were actually asking them for input. And if we can be clear about that and clear about who is making the decision, that can help to build trust. So our aim is to seek the maximum amount of involvement that is appropriate for any particular situation, and knowing who does get to make decisions. So as you're considering how you want to make decisions within your coalition and how each decision might be made within the coalition, things you might consider are partner buy-in. How much do partners need to be involved so that they can confidently support the implementation of the decision? How much time can you spend on making the decision? I think it was Karen who talked about she likes to lead with consensus decision-making and recognizing that that's challenging to do, and you may not always have the time. I think talking about time can be tricky. We can often feel like we are pressed to make a decision, or that things are urgent, that there is this sense of urgency, when in actuality, it will be more effective if we take longer to have greater group involvement and buy-in in a decision, and we're actually able to go fast to go slow later on. So on that involvement spectrum, you saw both a group votes and working on group consensus. So let's break down those two in just a minute. So in the chat box, I'd like you to type some of the pros and cons of voting. What are the pros and cons of using the good old majority rules voting process? All right, so June lets us know about one of the cons. It can be awkward. The coalition is theirs, but we often have new people or outsiders, and they're sitting there. Am I supposed to be voting? Yeah, so it's like, who gets to vote? How long do you have to be part of the group to have a vote? Okay, so at any particular time that you're taking a vote, not everybody may be present. Those voting could be missing some crucial information. A good part about it is your voice can be heard. You're asking everybody, at least everybody who's present, to weigh in. If your decision isn't picked, you could lose some enthusiasm. Should there also be some discussion after the vote has been taken? Do you need a certain threshold of people to make the vote? Yeah, if you're outvoted, maybe you've lost the investment in the coalition. So pros of voting, it's very familiar. We all know what voting is. It's efficient. I think it's generally considered a fair process by most, although folks have raised some good questions about, does everybody get to vote? What if somebody's not there? Good questions. And you've also raised some of those cons about that there is a sense of winners or losers, that my idea didn't get picked. The thing I thought was the right thing to do, we're not going to do. So maybe I've lost investment now. So let's switch to talking about consensus. So when we talk about consensus, what we're talking about here is that everybody has an opportunity to voice an opinion, and then the group works to a place where everybody can agree to support the ultimate decision that's made. It may not be your top choice, but everybody agrees to support it. What are some of the pros and cons of working with consensus? Feel free to unmute too if that's easier. Yep, it can take a while, Jennifer says. What else? The final result could not reflect the majority view. So we're giving a space for people to talk, but perhaps if we have some very vocal or some folks who hold certain amount of power in the room, those still might be the loudest voices. It seems more collaborative. It allows everybody to participate. There's always one who might not have full buy-in. So that kind of goes back to the time part of working to a place where everybody can agree on something. May take more time. You know where everybody stands. So it does ensure buy-in in the sense that you have said, we're not going to stop talking about this until we've reached a place where we can come to some level of agreement. So it can increase the likelihood of successful implementation of a decision. We're taking in various different perspectives into account. We're striving for a win-win. It definitely is time consuming. And one person with very strong views, as Art mentions, can hold up the whole process. So we're going to skip over, Elizabeth and Wanda, the poll that I had mentioned for the sake of time, but would love to talk just briefly before I turn it over to MJ about the fist to five technique. So this is a voting or consensus building or decision-making technique that you can use when working with a group. You can use this as a way to build consensus. You could also use this as a way to get a pulse on a group. So it's basically you ask folks to vote with their hand on a decision. So this is after you've had a lot of discussion as a group. Everybody understands what the issue is. You've had some back and forth about different opinions or ideas. You lay out the proposal to the group, and then you ask folks to vote using their fist to five fingers. So fist is somebody saying, no way, I'm not going to go along with it. I'm going to block this action from moving forward. One or two, I have some serious or partial concerns. I'm willing to go along with it. I'm not going to block things from moving forward, but I think there's some things we need to talk about. Three, good, I'm on board. 4 and 5 are stronger support. Yeah, I think this is a good idea. 5, you're saying, I think this is a great idea, and I'm going to actively work to help make it happen. So I want to try this very quickly. If you will turn your cameras on, I'm going to set out a proposal here. So let's say that we've been talking about this as our group that's been meeting. And the proposal is that everybody who's working from home with our organization will now have their electric bill paid by the organization. So I see waving hands. I've got some 10s up there. Okay, some of you are very fast to vote. So think about where you are with this idea. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you. Go ahead and type in your number if you're not on screen. Keep it up so I can see where people's numbers are. Okay, so thank you, those of you who are typing it in as well. Okay, can I hear from somebody who is a 1 or a 2? I don't see anybody blocking right now. Can I hear from somebody who's a 1 or a 2? Why are you a 1 or a 2 on this issue? Go ahead and unmute and tell us. Tabby or Ashley, or others of you who were at 2.
Okay, I'll say something. I'm not initially against it. So I'm a 2-3 because I'm not against it. But with caveats. Is the whole organization working from home? And if so, are they on a hybrid schedule? Can we get maybe a square footage of the space that they're working in and amortize our payment that way? Like, I have questions, you know, I'm not, okay. I try not to ever be immediately against something. So.
Okay. All right. So Ashley's got some questions, and that's why Ashley was a 2 or a 3 on this one. So let's hear from somebody who was a 4 or a 5. Why were you a 4 or a 5?
I just need to hear the whole picture. You know, what might I not be thinking through? It sounds wonderful, but is there something I'm missing?
Yeah, great. So this is thank you so much. You can put your hands down. Appreciate you doing that quick little demo. So if we were doing this for real, we would have had a lot more conversation to get Ashley's questions and to get some of the, allow Karen and others to hear about what might I not be thinking about. So one of the benefits of doing this is you can not only start to come to consensus and say, you know what, we didn't have anybody blocking that vote. So we're good to move forward on this idea. You know, we have said that as a group, we're going to move forward with anything that's not blocked. The other way is to say, there were so many ones and twos that we could move forward, but I can tell it's got pretty weak support and there are a lot of concerns. So I think we need to keep talking about this a little bit more. One of the great things for a meeting leader or coalition facilitator is when you see those people with fives, like where's Dimitri? Like that's who I'm going to call. Like I'm calling on you to help me make this happen because I saw your great enthusiasm. So it helps you see not only who's in favor of something, but who's going to be willing to help you do some work to make something happen. So I will also say one last thing about this, and then I promise I'm passing it over to you, MJ. That one great example I heard in a group who had done the Fist to 5 technique was they were talking about prioritizing how to use city funding and sidewalks. Increasing sidewalk access was one of the pieces. It originally had not gotten enough votes to be moved as a priority until one woman who used a wheelchair spoke up and said, this is the way that I'm able to access things in our city. This is the way I'm able to interact with our neighborhood. Even though other folks would not have voted for it for their personal interest, being able to have that space for discussion, that made a lot of sense to a lot of people. So it changed some minds. So I think going through that consensus and discussion process, doing Fist to 5 or something similar, can also help gain greater understanding so that even if it's not necessarily your first choice, you have greater understanding about why a group might move forward with a particular decision and are able to support it more. Okay, I'm being quiet, MJ, and tossing it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Just before I get moving, I'm going to encourage everyone to just kind of like move a little bit and kind of loosen up. We're in the final stretch. It's Friday. Saturday Eve is upon us. And you can keep on doing that throughout my conversation today. It will not distract me at all. Please do what you need to keep yourself motivated in this conversation. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. And really to start, I started my career in hard conversations, and that's what really brings me here today. Hard conversations are really what roots us in the need for change. We've identified an issue, whether that be visible through data in our community, or if it is, we're connecting with a community member and they are saying, man, I'm seeing this and I just don't know how to get there. But those are our hard conversations that really shift our practice in public health. And I'm really going to encourage us to keep moving, both figuratively through those conversations and also together here physically as you are able, as you feel good and comfortable to do so. But really my hard conversations are rooted in harm reduction, and that is public health. I had a professor who reframed public health for me when I was just a young learning individual. And they said, we have entire systems dedicated to reducing the harm of human behavior. The CDC exists because people make decisions, right? And those decisions impact their health. And what we're doing in all these coalitions is trying to reduce the harm of whatever behavior and impacted resulting condition that person's engaging in, that our community is engaging in at whole. And so my approach is really founded in harm reduction. And I hear what you're saying. How can we make that a little bit better for somebody today? How can we make that a little bit better for our community today? And really, that's what shapes my practice and shapes my conversations and also shapes the way I engage with community. There are inevitable harms that are perpetuated by our systems. Sarah started off by naming all of the identities that she holds at face value, right? We didn't get all the way down the list of the hundreds and thousands of identities that exist, but she went through the top 8. I see you, Sarah. And what that does is say, you know, I acknowledge that my identities are connected to a system, and that system has inevitably supported and provided privilege and also disenfranchised and provided oppression to different identities in our community. And so part of our conversation is acknowledging the harms of the systems that we are a part of, that we embrace, that we benefit from, and also working with community members in an authentic way and saying, you know, I see that this has happened, and I know that we can work together on this thing because we know that this exists. So Sarah, I'll have you advance a slide. Yeah, cool. So what does it look like for public health to actually engage in a way that reduces harm, in a way that is community-led, for coalitions in particular? Some examples, and I'll have you just blow up the chat for me here, are really, maybe we're led by community need and community voice, and maybe we're doing those things before funds are distributed. What are some examples that you all have seen of how this can be done well for any health issue? Drop it in the chat. If I encourage you to move away from your keyboard, that is my own fault. I said move in a way that feels good for you. This is what we're talking about when we say participation is a challenge over Zoom. Here we go. Bueller, Bueller.
I'm going to ask for just a little more clarity on the question that you want, because I'm just kind of not following how I need to respond. So maybe it's just me.
Yeah, so what are some examples of how public health in any initiative could potentially do this well? This being community engagement, coalition building. What are some ways or approaches that you have seen be effective for your community? Face-to-face, yes. Program promotion, community forums are incredible and super helpful. When outcomes are accomplished, we celebrate those things. Yes, finding your champions. Yeah, who are your community gatekeepers? Critical to identify the folks that have the trust and rapport with the community that you're trying to work with. And consistency. Yes, beautiful. Thank you all. All right. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that we hit the ground running. And what that means is, and Sarah, I'll have you advance to my cute road slide. Yeah. Is we're starting off the right way. And the right way looks a lot of different ways. And so I encourage you to embrace the fluid nature of that concept. But we need to engage the community before we write that grant. Before we write that grant and say we're going to engage these organizations, these types of people, all of these things, there is a difference between you are welcome in this coalition, and this coalition was built with you and for you. There is a difference between having to renovate something to make a space safe for someone versus building that space from the get. And so I'd encourage you as the coalition leads to figure out how to build that space with your community before you tie dollars to it. I understand that's not always how our process happens. It's the chicken and the egg concept, right? Do we write the grant so we have the money to do the thing? Or do we do the thing so we can write the grant and have the money? And there's obviously nuance in between, but those are the really two stark contrasts we see in organizations, particularly those that are government tied. And so what do you do if we did the thing? Can you tell us the difference between, oh, sorry, Sarah, I saw the chat. So let's talk about what we have accomplished when we do this well. Previously, we saw those examples in the chat of these are the things that are working well for us when we do it this way. The outcomes of that are incredible. The outcomes of those types of strategies are incredible. What that does is you are building a relationship. You are not just building a coalition. You're building a relationship with every single person in that community space, that network, that work group, that whatever you want to call it, whatever works for your folks at the time, that's what we'll call it. But if we are engaging in a way for the long haul, this becomes more than an extractive and transactional relationship. And what that does for us is we know the things that our community members are interested in. We know their vision for the issues that we talk about in conversation around this work. And we know what approaches that they think are going to work. We can tie those into all the narratives and grant funder budgets that the funders love to see, right? But it's easier to write that grant with them than it is without them every single day of the week. And it will keep you from having to go back to the funder and say, we've learned some things and we're suggesting we do it this way. Is that okay? You've already gained permission this way. Additionally, what we're able to do is build this mutual trust with our community partners, and that is so critical to them being able to call us too when they see an issue. This can't be us always reaching and saying, I have this thing, will you help me? Will you help me? Will you help me? They can come to us and say, we're seeing these problems and no one's showing up. And you've shown up for me before. I'm really hoping that we can work together to address this. And that is when we've made it. That is when we've made it, when our community comes to us with their problems, not us going to them with our grant. Okay. So I like this visual. This is my screwed up visual. I paid for something. It was supposed to be delightful. Oh man, I'm so excited. I dropped it. I screwed it up. I put all this energy in. I went to my favorite local ice cream dealer and they said, MJ, here is your mint chocolate chip cone. It is coated in chocolate. We're ready to go. And then we look at it. This is the not glamorous part, right, Tracy? Yes, Jennifer, they are my ice cream dealer. They are not my vendor. We are coping with the pandemic and it is okay. So what we did the thing, we screwed it up. We wrote the grant and then we were like, oh man, I forgot to ask folks if they want to work on this with me. I put hours and hours and hours into this grant proposal and not an hour over coffee with my community partner. Man, we've all done this, right? We've all done this. We've all done this thing. We've all dropped our ice cream cone and been really upset about it. And our community's upset about it too. And so what's tricky about this is we still need to incorporate all the needs that maybe we didn't write into the grant, right? And this is the part where we have to navigate different logistics that maybe we didn't sign up for. Maybe we inherited a grant. Somebody else wrote the thing. They dropped the ice cream cone for you, which is even worse, in my opinion. You didn't sign up for that flavor. And so we have to figure out how do we revisit? How do we take a step back and let's meet with the grant funder let's start there and say, you know, I'm looking at this and it feels like it's missing a few elements. And I'd like to see how we can dream a little bit within the parameters of this fund. Because as I'm engaging with community over coffee or ice cream per se, they're saying this isn't exactly the approach they want to take. And you could be having these conversations both like one-on-one over coffee, over a virtual meeting with someone, or in a coalition space. If you've built the trust and power in that space, people tell you how they're feeling about your approach, the strategies you've got in place, and you may get that feedback. And really what all good community organizing and coalition building is relationships. And so you have to build the relationship both with the funder so that you can be more agile than the document that is holding you to these funds says, but you also have to build relationships with your community partners so that they can be agile with you. And so the next slide, we're going to briefly talk about power. And you've heard power in all of the conversations today, and power is so critical to building effective relationships. And we've talked about building power and sharing power, and power can be defined a lot of different ways. Power could be capacity and financial. It could be the space that you occupy in a relationship. It could be your positionality within an organization or the positionality of your organization. And when we look at the conversations around harm reduction that we had earlier and say, how does this tie to power? Who's making the rules for whom? And why do they have that ability to name someone else's narrative? These are all parts of how we can build effective and authentic relationships. So for me, I know that as a white person who is trans, that I have different power than someone who is Black or Indigenous or any person of color who is trans. And identifying that differential, or even that I present more masculine within my trans identity than someone who presents more feminine within their identity, that is power. I know that my masculinity gives me power in different spaces. And so I need to know how to use my power, but also how to name and acknowledge and shift the power in a space. But you can't do that unless you know what you got. Okay, you can't change the power you occupy or use your power unless you can identify what you have. Okay. And so community engagement of any kind in the development of these power or partnerships requires these relationships, and relationships, good, bad, or ugly, all have power dynamics. And it's critical as practitioners that we understand the power that we bring into spaces. How we interact with people in spaces is also critical to this. But also the power that our organization has had over a community historically. If we've never extended a hand of any kind, we haven't given them a reason to trust us, to build that mutual relationship so then they feel they can reach to us as well. And we haven't given them a reason to build anything with us. Why would I extend my energy, which is so valuable, to initiatives that maybe I'm not exactly bought into, for one, that don't serve me, for two, and don't interact or identify the power that your organization has had over me historically. These are all reasons why people do not enter into coalition work. Sarah and Tracy really talked about the what's in it for me, and that's all it right there. That's it. And the best way I have found to break down power differentials and build mutual trust is to engage with coffee, to engage with lunch. You know, I have a friend who says, if we don't eat, we don't meet. And that is really food and beverage and joy is really what brings relationships forward. And, without that, we won't build that long term. We might have them engage in our short-term coalition work, but we won't have them for the long haul. And so these relationships both will help you now, but they'll also help you later. Okay. And so building in that my voice matters, that's that trust and engagement and power sharing, and decision making is critical to this. And if we aren't, as an organization or as a coalition, working to build power within that person's organization as well, maybe we're helping them build capacity in our grant as part of our new adjustment with our funder. That's that olive branch. If they've got staff, holy cow, what an asset. They're more likely to want staff on things that they want to work on, though. So make sure you're writing with them to start. But if that's where you enter, then that's a good place to start as well. So that's a little on power. But how do we work backwards, given that we've already screwed this up? All right. Our ice cream's on the ground. We didn't bring them ice cream. Ah, man. So we need to go and meet all of our partners, traditional, non-traditional, anyone we think, hasn't had a voice at this table that we're building, in this new room or space that we're building. And we need to talk about the issues and say, what are you seeing? What is your community seeing? This is what I know. This is what I'm seeing. I also just so happen to have this pot of money, and I can use it in X, Y, and Z ways. And I'm wondering if we can work together to identify ways that we can build strategies under these three component or areas. So a lot of times we have community partners who say, well, I'd really like to do this. And that's where we have to flex our muscles a little bit and say, that sounds like community connection building. Yeah, we can work with that. You wanna put together a networking moment for your community. Let's say the queer community is desperate for connection, and actually connection is the opposite of substance use. And we should be writing that in every one of our grants. That is the easiest way for us to build community with folks, to build trust with folks, and power share with folks. And some of the easiest language to work with grantors on. And so when you make your pitch, when you build that what's in it for me conversation with that person, give them some of the parameters that you're stuck in and say, I know this isn't maybe exactly what you dreamed up when we started this conversation, and just level with them and say, these are the ways that we can work together. And I'm wondering if we identify something that is outside of those things, if we can work together to find a way to get there. Because that's your here and now, but it's also your later. Okay. And that's building that long-term relationship. So if you're in your coalition, you've got these identified strategies, you're long down the road, you say, these are the things we're working on. We've largely lost or missed out on voices like yours. I'm wondering if you can support us in the ways in which we educate and build awareness around naloxone distribution or overdose prevention. Are there additional ways you think would be effective for your community? And really approach this with curiosity. Have open-ended questions, and don't forget to do something with your answers. I'm really hoping we could work on those things together. I don't think I can do it right here and now. I'm kind of strapped in my current situation. You can blame the funder all day long. It's okay. Use them to your advantage if they've got you in a grip, you can say, well, the funder I have right now really has me in these three categories. And I'm wondering if we can kind of toy with this concept that you're telling me about. How can we build on that thing that you want to do? So really just saying, I'm here for you. I may not have everything you need, but I want to not only build this work with you, but build a relationship with you. So additionally, we can work on establishing values with the group. And what this does is kind of put some rails on the cart, but also keeps everyone in an accountable and respectful space. If we are able to include best practice in this conversation, that really ties everything together for us. Sometimes we have wild hair ideas, right? And they don't align with some of the things that we know. And we have to be able to roll with that to a certain extent. But the conversation or the one-liner I like to use is, well, we know these things about this issue. And I'm wondering how you see this working. Why is this different? Tell me more about that. Because maybe they have the reason. Maybe they've seen it work. And, you know, we know that, for example, DARE didn't work for everyone, but it worked for some. So maybe we need a multifaceted approach where we're building on some of the concepts that come into a space. And then we're also saying, you know, evidence-based practice has its own issues, right? So let's move to best practice and best practice for your community. I say evidence-based practice has its own issues very deliberately, in that evidence has largely been used by white people to dictate how and what we're able to do. And evidence has largely been about white middle-class people. And that is not necessarily the populations we're trying to serve. And so we have to be agile around this issue as well. So when I say move to best practice, that is why. But we can effectively navigate our relationships. All of these things are relationships. We should be having conversations with our funders regularly. We need to have conversations with our community regularly. We need to invest in new ideas and innovation regularly. We're more likely to move with our funder and be agile with our funder if they know where our intentions lie. And if they are able to identify, wow, these folks are really working with community, let's work with them. We in Colorado, we've got an obscene amount of money flowing in, and it's been awesome to see some of the new and innovative ideas. And largely money is a catalyst for some of those ideas, but money without ties to it is the most valuable. And if you can continuously be building that conversation with your funder, you will find more money without ties to it. Because they know how to work with community. They know how to engage, and they're building cool stuff. Your community members really want to see that you're doing a blend of approaches. You're leaning into innovation with curiosity, and you're moving into best practice. And what that does is open the door to serve diverse communities and underrepresented communities better than we ever have before. And we also need to recognize we're not everything for everyone. Our organization might not be the best one to work with Black and Brown communities. You know, if I look at our organization, we have a growing representation of people who identify as Black, but we don't have the representation to be making decisions about their community. And we have to make sure that we're bridging the relationships and building true mutual trust and mutual respect and power to make sure that they have decision-making power at tables that they historically have not been invited to. I think I'm running short on time. I see Sarah leaning into the monitor. But really, the takeaways here is the relationships you build are the keys to your success around making this balance happen. And if you don't have those relationships, whether they be with community, with your funders, with innovation, and with folks who are willing to be a little bit more daring, I would argue public health is not daring enough. That is where that balance is struck. is finding those authentic and trusting mutual, not transactional relationships, and really bridging that power divide that comes between the funder and small community organizations, whether they're traditional or non-traditional.
Thanks, MJ.
Yeah.
So I really want to lift up something that MJ talked about, which would love to hear folks share some of their experiences in the chat of I saw that several people had inherited the grant that they're working on. And so you may be in a position where you weren't co-developing the project with community as you were writing the grant.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if folks have run into the issue where their grant was written to focus on fill in the blank, opioids, smoking, suicide, fill in the blank. And when you went to talk with some community partners, they said, yeah, that's not really our issue. I see a couple nodding heads. Can someone unmute and kind of share what the example was of what your grant says you should be focused on, and maybe what the community is saying their actual priority is? And thanks for those of you who just clicked your camera on.
This is Shelley Marlowe in Branson. I'm relatively new to the area and to our coalition, and so I'm just working on getting to know the other organizations and what they do and how we could possibly work together. And we have a really great organization called Elevate Branson, and they do just all kinds of great, wonderful things with housing, homelessness, food insecurities, all this kind of stuff. So I have tried from two different angles now to find out how we could possibly work together. And both times they're like, well, that's not our issue. We don't do, because we're a DFC funded coalition. And so they just say, oh, drug use is not our issue, sorry. And just, really kind of close the door. So it's not left up for any further conversation. So now I'm looking for a third strategy. I'm gonna let some time go by, but looking for a third strategy to engage them. Because I can see it, and I'm kind of flabbergasted as to why they can't see it.
Yeah, Shelley, I think I'd let the dust settle a little, and then I'd invite them for an open-ended coffee that has no tie to it, and see if you can build a relationship before you can put an ask to it. Largely, if people like you and know you, they're more willing to hang out with you at a coalition meeting. You seem likable, so I think you should work on that approach.
Catch me on a good day, maybe.
Boy, I love that reminder of time as a strategy. I mean, that relationships do take time to build, which is not always quite in sync with quarterly reports and grant deliverables.
Well, I will just say that it was in a different framed conversation to ask, if we can sit down and just kind of discuss, what they do and what we do. But I think as soon as they saw, because in my email, I said, we're Adapt, this is what we do. And I think they just saw this is what we do. And they're like, nope.
Yeah.
And thanks, Astrid, for reminding us how valuable young people's voices can be in terms of that innovative ideas coming forward.
Shelley, hi, my name is Robbie Mullins, and I'm from Southeast Oklahoma. So, hey, y'all. What I might say is, and I've been involved with coalitions for a long time, and I'll be honest with you, whenever you're working with a group and your focus changes within that. Okay, so for instance, we've been working on opioids all this time for the last 5 years. Now we've switched. We're working on alcohol and marijuana now, okay, within our communities. So sometimes what I want to say to you though is, and I've found, sometimes get a new messenger, okay? It might be that there's somebody else that can get through to that person that you might not be able to. For
Mhm.
a long time, we tried to pass the social host ordinance before the state finally passed the social host statewide. And I kept going before the city council and talking to the different city council members and different ones. And finally, one day, I guess a light bulb went off in my head and I thought, well, first of all, it didn't help that I had 2 city councilmen that own liquor stores. So that was not in my favor.
Nope.
But what I did, I backed off. I got our youth group, okay, to go present it to the city council, and it went over. I mean, they passed it just like that, okay? They couldn't say no to them because it was them speaking, you know, why they needed it passed. So
They use that
sometimes
power, don't they?
yes, they do. But sometimes you just have to look, and sometimes we are not always the messenger that needs to be the one talking to that person. So,
Absolutely,
Good
Robbie.
point. Good point.
Mhm.
Robbie, you were getting lots of claps and snaps for that one. So good job. All right. Well, I want to move us to our final closing reflection and just share first some summary, high-level summary of what we talked about both yesterday and today. That we really talked about tapping into the what's in it for me, making sure that we're spending some time getting to know the individuals and the partner agencies that we want to be involved with, and love how MJ set us up for, you know, food and coffee, which is harder to do via Zoom, but not impossible. So really having those open-ended conversations that are just about building the relationship and hearing more about what's important to you, so that can in the future bridge to how might we find a mutually beneficial relationship going forward. Loved hearing from Tracy today about thinking about how we can be innovative with our coalition structures and reimagining things. So we are truly in a space these past 2 years of needing to reimagine just about everything we do. So we're in a good place. We've got what we need to be able to do that. So break out of our box of the noon coalition meeting held at our agency. Maybe that works for some. Maybe there are other ways to engage other individuals and partners who we want to talk with. And then really important about making sure that we're not asking for folks' token involvement, that we are truly interested in building relationships, that we're interested in authentically engaging with those partners, building trust with them, and sharing the power of decision-making and of the direction of the coalition and the priorities of the coalition. Is so important, and how important decision-making and being thoughtful and transparent about how we go about making decisions is part of that. And across all of these elements, we brought in ideas of ways that we can be inclusive and collaborative from the beginning, and how important self-reflection is, and how key that is in helping us move our own work forward. So I want to ask you 30 seconds to spend some time thinking about this question of what's something that you want to keep doing with your work, what's something you want to improve on, what's a practice you want to start doing, and what's something you want to stop doing. And drop that in the chat for us while LaShonda closes us out for the day. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, MJ, Tracy, and Sarah. We certainly learned a lot today and had great conversations. One of the things that I noticed, I love seeing Carrie come back, and she said that she's new to prevention. But, you know, Carrie, I want you to also know that Robbie Mullins wasn't kidding. She's been in prevention for a while, and here she is also still learning and growing. And so, you know, we practice prevention, right? Like we talk about the evidence base, but we truly are practicing from day to day, just as physicians are practicing, lawyers are practicing. And so, you know, in that practice, we have to continue to sharpen and hone our skills. It is the end of the hour, and I would like you all to turn your attention to the evaluation link that we have in the chat box. So I placed an evaluation link in the chat box. I also want to let you all know that the PTTC has a position open for a training and technical assistance specialist. So I'm not going to lose this opportunity to say, please go to our website at pttcnetwork.org. If you or someone you know is interested in providing workforce development and problem-solving support to prevention professionals and community members in Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Louisiana. Oh, I almost lost that. Another thing that I also want to let you know is save the date, October 26th. We will have a webinar on methamphetamines, sort of the state of methamphetamines within the Southwest region. And we partnered with the Great Lakes region to talk about the state of methamphetamines. So you'll certainly see data from our region around methamphetamines and the growth that we've been seeing in that area. So please, if you haven't, go to our website. There's lots of great things and opportunity to register for the methamphetamine webinar on October 26th at 10 a.m. Central Time. So if you're a Mountain Time, that's 9 a.m. If you're on Eastern Time, that's 11. If you're in Alaska, I don't know. And so on and so forth. So you all, thank you so much for joining us today. And please, I'd love to see you all show up again at other webinars offered by the Southwest PTTC, and know that other PTTC networks, they've got great resources there too. Join them at their webinars or workshops, or pick up some of their resources as well. Thank you so much and have a great weekend.